Okay, so good day, everyone. My name is Lauren Paramoor, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this webinar. I'm speaking from Cape Town, South Africa, so it's afternoon for me, but greetings to you wherever you find yourself, morning or evening. I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of the co-hosts of this webinar, which is PSI, Public Services International, Third World Network, People's Health Movement, and AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Today, our discussion is guided by the question, whose PABS system should benefit sharing wait for a pandemic to be declared? So what I can say to you is that you'll hear from three speakers today, and I think all of them will say that we should not wait for a pandemic to be declared. The first is Chitali Rao, scientific researcher and legal advisor at Third World Network. Our second speaker will be Huyan Kwong, head of analysis and senior legal and policy advisor at MSF, and Peter van Huisten, who's a senior researcher at the South African National Bioinformatics Institute here in Cape Town. Each speaker will have 10 to 15 minutes. Unfortunately, we don't have translation, and so that is one constraint that we're working with today. And so the conversation will be entirely in English. So maybe just to frame the issue a little bit, I think most people will be familiar with the discussion that we're about to have. But it might be useful to have some background nevertheless. We're about to enter what might be the final round of negotiations of the Intergovernmental Working Group on the Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing. And one might frame this conversation as having been dominated by something that should have been an established principle by the time we got to May 2025 and the pandemic accord was, or the pandemic agreement was adopted at the WHO last year, which is that pathogen and benefit sharing should be placed on an equal footing. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that pathogen access is very much framed as something that should be unhindered, and that benefit sharing remains something that is not yet operationalized, that it remains opaque, and certainly that there is very little legal certainty around benefit sharing and how it would happen. Yesterday, AHF had a webinar in which Ms. Nurafiza Hamza of Malaysia noted that, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, that it's important to note that the PABS Annex negotiations aren't about negotiating an R&D platform, that the database is about negotiating something that will deliver equity, legal certainty, benefit sharing in the context of a pandemic emergency and also a public health emergency of international concern. What we've seen, unfortunately, is that the pathogen database discussions, the WCLN discussions, tend to focus on whether mechanisms such as user registration, track and trace should be incorporated, whether non-commercial users should be required to register when they access pathogens. And all of this is part of a conversation to uncouple, I think, and this is my opinion, but to uncouple access to pathogens from benefit sharing. And of course, I say that because if you don't know who is accessing pathogens, it becomes very difficult to identify who you should have benefit sharing contracts with once they access those pathogens. We can also add additional context, which is that there are countries, delegations that seem to emphasize that pathogen access need not come with user registration, that contracts to access pathogens need not happen upfront at the point of access, but that these contracts could be negotiated later down the line, perhaps when we're looking at commercialization based on accessing the pathogens and R&D that happens as a result. And those positions which really focus on unhindered access to pathogens without accountability and transparency measures, those positions at the moment tend to be pushed by the European Union, also Norway, Switzerland, Japan, and within the European Union, Germany. What we see is that in contrast, countries of the Global South, particularly the Africa Group and the Group for Equity, see registration upon accessing pathogens and also clear, transparent, and predictable contracts that have benefit sharing commitments at the point of access as part and parcel of operationalizing Article 12 and having the necessary information in place to ensure that pathogen access and benefit sharing can be placed on an equal footing. So maybe just before I hand over to the first speaker, I think one of the things that we're speaking about today is really the benefit sharing part of Article 12 and negotiations to operationalize benefit sharing. I think in various ways, many of the speakers will point not only to why benefit sharing is necessary, but how we can create legal certainty about the kinds of benefits that will be shared, who's responsible for them, both commercial and non-commercial users, and also what perhaps ecosystem changes these benefit sharing mechanisms can bring about, so that we move from a model of charity that focuses on donations and affordable pricing, and those are important and essential, but they're not sufficient. And so I think part of the conversation we want to have today is about benefit sharing mechanisms that can also transform the R&D and manufacturing landscape, so that there's a greater deal of geographically diversified manufacturing and local self-reliance. That is something that hopefully emerges out of the PABS Annex negotiations. So I will leave the introductory remarks there and welcome the first speaker, who is Chitali Rao. And Chitali will be speaking to us about benefit sharing and why it's necessary even before a pandemic emergency. So Chitali, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you for the introduction. And I'll just start with my presentation. Anya, I think there's some problem that's happening.
I can share. Is that okay?
Give me a second. I'll just try again. I think I should be able.
We were seeing your slides. We can see
It's
it.
fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you everyone for joining today. So what we need to discuss about today is why we need benefit sharing. So I think as Lorraine has already pointed out, that why is it that we should not be waiting for a pandemic or a PHEIC outbreak to happen, and why we should be well prepared on that. Well, of course, PABS is that instrument which will help us in building a resilient system that we do not have to look at what happened in the COVID, the inequities that we faced that time. So today we are actually not talking about a hypothetical future. We are actually talking about a system that is completely broken right now at the moment, and we are trying to fix it now. So before any next outbreak happens. So in that context, I will just like to walk you all through a few highlights that are there. So as Lauren already pointed out, that the first is that the WHO pandemic agreement was adopted last year, as we all are aware of. I think I will have to switch this off because it's just not. So the pandemic agreement was adopted in May last year, and I think this was one of the most historic moments. But Article 12, I think the backbone or the spine of it, the PABS Annex, still remains an unfinished business. So I think IGWG negotiations, which must conclude at WHS 79, and it deals with this part only. And I think the equity at the moment, of course, hangs in balance. So the second, I think, is that I will also be delving upon the current framework, of the way it categorizes manufacturers and developers that manufacture. So I believe that that frame is a bit narrow, and I will also tell you about how this frame is also linked to the revenue. It binds the participating manufacturers, but I will also help you go through a lot of other companies that are there. We are not just talking about Pfizer's, the Moderna's, and the AstraZeneca's. We'll also be talking about a lot of other actors that are there who profit enormously from the pathogen data that is there, and and how the commercial users ambit actually includes all of them also. The third important point that we would like to discuss is the digital sequence information loophole. We all know that in COVID mRNA, the system was basically built on digital shared genomic sequences and not just physical samples. So if we don't close this loophole today, the anonymous user loophole that we clearly see in the system, this entire PAB system can be legally circumvented. And the another important point is that the data from Mpox, Ebola, and COVID was damning. So we could clearly see during COVID-19 that Africa received only 6% of the global dosage, despite carrying 17% of the world's population. So I think we also saw it in Mpox that Africa got very few doses of the amount that it was needed. And in Ebola also, we know that majority of it is stockpiled with the United States with no delivery pathway for Africa. And lastly, I think we also, one of the key insights is that benefit sharing must be the floor. So access to VTDs during outbreaks, responses under Article 13.3 during PHICs, all this is very important. We need to look for non-exclusive royalty-free worldwide licenses, which actually are very important in addressing the structural inequities and also the supply side shortage. We also, I think it's important that we look at the annual monetary contributions, which will help us in better preparedness. And this is where my slide will also be touching upon the revenues and the commercial parts of it. We also need a very strong user registration, which avoids biopiracy and actually identifies the recipients. And we also look at standardized contractual agreements before accessing materials or data. I think this is a very general platform that will help us not only in this, but also in looking at how we tackle outbreaks or pandemics. So based on these, I think we are at a very critical juncture because the annex at the moment is still unresolved, and we have May 2026 to get this right. So what we decide now in these negotiations will actually help to determine whether the next pandemic repeats the iniquities that we saw in COVID-19, or whether we finally build a system that actually serves the global health equity. So based on these, I think the agenda that I will discuss in my presentation would basically be talking through 4 points. One is that what do pandemics and PHEICs tell us about the iniquities that are currently baked inside this system? We also look at who actually benefits from the benefit sharing mechanism, who is paying, who profits from the pathogen data in terms of commercials that I will be talking about. We also look at, is there a real market for these products, and how does that market, if it is there, look like? And then we also look at another proposition which is there in the instrument, and that is the licensing proposition. So with this, it's important that just a little bit of a walkthrough through what we saw previously, and we understand why it matters. So we must confront history from this, not from a theoretical perspective, I must say, but we must look at it from what has been documented. And we also see the measurable failures that are there across all the 3 outbreaks that we've seen in COVID-19, in Mpox, and in Ebola as well. So I think let me start with these numbers that I think should haunt us all. So during COVID-19, we actually saw Africa, which is home to 17% of the world's population, and it received only 6% of the vaccine doses by 2022. So we also know very well by a document where Oxfam had clearly said that South Africa paid 2.5 times more per AstraZeneca dose than the European Union did for the same vaccine. So while we saw Moderna and Pfizer earn approximately 93 billion in revenues with no benefit sharing mechanism that was linked to the gains from what the sequences had been shared from Africa for or other countries during the COVID-19. Similar was the case with Mpox also in the outbreak, where we saw that Africa, which actually bears 80% of the global disease burden, but it only received 10% of the doses when they were needed the most. So Nigeria initially received just 10,000 doses for a population of 220 million people, which were facing an escalating outbreak, and no manufacturing is there for Jynneos in Africa. So I think same we saw in Ebola, and there was this MSF report which very well documented it, that despite African countries which provided the pathogen samples and the trial data for the life-saving treatments for both the monoclonal antibodies, Inmazeb and Ibanga, we only saw 33% of the Ebola patients worldwide that received the treatment between 2020 and 22. Now, much of it we know from the report as well that it is stockpiled supplies with US, and there is no defined pathway for African governments. So what I show here are not just statistics, but I think they represent millions of preventable deaths, and it also shows a global fundamental breakdown of global solidarity. So I think that is why it is very important for us to negotiate an instrument right now, which is very strong on these aspects. So moving, yeah.
Could you slow down just a tiny bit?
Yeah, sure. So regarding the benefit sharing mechanism. So now the next critical question that we face here is that do we feel that the framework at the moment is too narrow? So the current PABS framework actually defines users and users as manufacturers and developers that manufacture. So that sounds reasonable if we look at the way the pathway has been traditionally. So traditionally, what we on the right side, if we look at is that there was a pathogen, and then that pathogen was isolated, and a vaccine or a drug was developed, and then a benefit sharing could happen. But this kind of a situation no longer exists in the world today. So for example, if I talk about a pathogen sequence, which is extracted from Democratic Republic of Congo, and tomorrow it flows through a cloud server to somewhere in Virginia, it is then processed by an AI model, which can be based globally, supposedly in London, and then it is synthesized into a construct which is based somewhere in California, and then maybe it is used by a diagnostic company which is again based out globally somewhere in France. So none of the actors are none of the actors here are actually the end manufacturers of the products that we've in traditional set being called them as VTDs, but all of them are a part of this bigger ecosystem that actually use these sequences. So the benefit sharing frameworks are still anchored in the first model, but industry is a lot operating with deep tech entering into the market, and a lot of technology, synthetic biology is coming into it. A lot of those are non-manufacturers as well. So it's kind of good that commercial users have now been included within the framework of it. So just to give you a glimpse of how the sequences are used. So we all know that today vaccines like COVID-19 mRNA, these were also built on the digital shared genomic sequences, and they were not just purely based on pathogen samples. So if we don't establish binding rules on DSI users, so this is where it is actually coming. Why we need a system where the DSI loophole is completely closed is that because if today we don't establish binding rules on DSI users, the entire PAB system can be circumvented. So for example, we have companies like Twist Biosciences and Jingo Bioworks. They have huge revenues of 377 million or maybe 170 million around, and they use these sequences to create synthetic DNA constructs. For example, on the left, you can see that Twist clearly mentions that human mpox virus controls are based on sequences from Congo Basin or West Africa clades of human and for mpox, formerly known as monkeypox. So now what I just want to share is that they typically start with the digital sequence information and not just natural products or extracts. So these are very highly profitable businesses which are built on shared genetic resources. If you look at the right side, this is a SEC filing that was done by Jingo Bioworks. So as Jingo openly states in their SEC filings that typically we select candidate sequences from databases. So generally, without having knowledge of the geographical origin of the sequence or the genetic sequence from where it was obtained. So this is not just accidental. This is the new business model that is operating these days, especially in terms of synthetic biology companies. So that is why it is very important that the anonymity concept of DSI is tackled in the PABS sequence, in the PABS negotiations. So if I also talk about other users, these are the companies which are currently not under the user concept, because I've just put one example here so we can clearly understand. For example, these are not traditional manufacturing companies or even synthetic biology companies, but the upper one is a animal vaccine manufacturer. So this is this is BI, which works exclusively on animal health. But if you look at the patents that these companies have filed, they are working extensively on Nipah virus vaccines. And here they are using the original sequences of Nipah virus from the Malaysian strain. So we can clearly see that these are the companies also which are using the sequences and producing vaccines though they are for animal purposes. Similarly, if you see Pebbles Lab also, Pebbles is typically an agricultural company, and they are utilizing the sequence information to develop commercial applications such as vector control technologies. But these are at the end not manufacturers or developers, but they are currently kind of commercial users of the sequences. So I just gave this as a glimpse for everyone to be clear that what kind of commercial users are there and what are the kind of revenues that can flow from there. So the moving on to the next part is there actually a market for the products? Because we've often seen that people will argue that there is no market here. And then the focus is on, because the focus is basically on non-manufacturers as a distraction. So let us look at a bit of financial flows actually. So this is the traditional revenues that we've seen from the companies coming. So we see that there are vaccines like Comirnaty, and then we have Spikevax, and then we have other vaccines which are typically for COVID-19 on the left side. So you can see that in total, they have earned revenues up to 95.9 billion across 21 to 25. I'm just talking about Comirnaty from Pfizer. So if you look at 2025, you can see that even Paxlovid today is also generating a revenue of 2.5 billion annually. And that's a product that they've used it for COVID. So these are huge numbers, and these are all built on sequences that developing countries provide under the expectations that benefits will flow back to them. But initially they did not. But I think that was a market failure, and that market failure we are trying to address. Similarly, on the right side, if you look at it, we can clearly see the sales data from dengue, mpox, and Ebola, and all of these are also generating data, and all of these are definitely covered under the pathogens of pandemic potential. Now, if we look at the commercial ecosystem around the pathogen sequences of the companies that I talked about, which are not typically the manufacturers, but would somewhere fall under commercial ecosystem. So these are the aggregating revenues. Now, we are not claiming that every dollar from what AWS or other companies, or even Zoetis, which is another animal vaccine company, flows directly from pathogen sequence data, because that would be an overstatement. And we want to be very precise on that. Each of these actors has actually built a very documented and a growing commercial product line that is directly dependent on pathogen sequence information. So, for example, we have companies like Zoetis, which develop vaccines for zoonotic pathogens, and the source of 75% of emerging infections actually come from them. So, similarly, if we talk about Biomerics, so Biomerics also builds assays that are built on pathogenic sequences. I already talked about Twist and Jingo, and these are also the ones that are built on similar platforms. So this is the kind of a revenue that we can see that is being generated from companies that are actually the commercial users. Now, something is very clear, that the genomic data platforms, if you look at the market projections, the genomic data platforms market alone is projected to be 20 billion by 2034. A large part of which is driven by pandemic preparedness contracts. It's either by outbreak surveillance or by pathogen monitoring. So this 20 billion market does not exist without sequences that the countries share during the outbreaks, or maybe before the outbreaks, or maybe on a regular purposes. So with commercial users now included in the scope of PABS instrument, asking them to register, to contribute proportionally, and to acknowledge that the commercial success is built on shared common grounds is actually what we are looking for from this. Moving on to the last part of it, there's also addition of something which is like licensing proposition. I think this is why we propose a licensing framework as a central pillar of PABS reforms, because bigger manufacturers must provide non-exclusive, royalty-free, and worldwide licenses as a default. So this should not be a negotiated exception that we are looking at. And also, if I talk about, this is the architecture of actually a genuine equity. We are actually talking about non-exclusive, because we've already seen in case of pandemics that sometimes the manufacturers may not be able to supply, and they may not be able to scale up. For example, we heard this in case of mpox also, that they were not able to scale up the production or supply. That is why what we are looking at the moment is a non-exclusive license to WHO. Now, We saw in case of COVID also that Pfizer and Moderna were shielded by extensive patents and trade secrets. Neither the company was ready to grant non-exclusive licenses, nor there was a shared technology, manufacturing technology with the transfer hub. So we saw this failure, and hence what we are asking for is a guaranteed non-exclusive license, technology know-how, and making licensing agreement public for the purpose of transparency and accountability across the PAB system. So what an equitable PAB system must include, I think ending it, I must say that the most important, I think emphasizing it, it's not just about stopping scientific collaboration. It's talking about a very fair and sustainable system. So we are talking about an equitable PAB system that must include the economic flows in the pathogen sequence ecosystem. We also talk about a licensing model that could work at scale. So first, the most important point that the important ask is that it should be binding in kind with coupled with monetary benefits. So we ask for setting aside percentage of real-time production of VTDs. It is a floor and it is not a ceiling. It's not just from the VTD manufacturers, but it is also from developers, and the other users are there. So the second, as I just discussed, the most important point to tap in the commercial users, we need to close the DSI loophole. We need to prevent anonymous access, mandatory user registration and data access agreements for all PAB sequence databases. What we need is complete traceability mechanism or measures with measures like unique identifiers. There should not be any anonymous access for commercial entities. I think the most third meaningful ask that is that predefined benefit sharing guarantees. We do not want to repeat the story that we saw in COVID-19, in Mpox or in Ebola. Therefore, we are looking for binding commitments that must be agreed before any outbreak. We need to have PHICs or a pandemic emergency. We need pre-negotiated delivery pathways, priority allocation to endemic countries, procurement mechanism for African governments and sub-licensing rights to developing manufacturers. So, and I think another important ask is the standardized contracts. These bilateral ad hoc negotiations actually reproduce COVID era Q failures. So I think the go-to thing is having standardized contracts because they will enable speed and equity both simultaneously, and they will at the end also enable a quick conclusion of contracts through the inbuilt concessions of flexibilities that can be given in the contract themselves. And last that I just talked about is the licensing agreements. It is very important to have non-exclusive licenses from developers and manufacturers of PTD because we to WHO for sub-licensing of production and supply by default. So I think we also need to ensure that the technical negotiation stays connected with what we call as its moral imperative. So as we saw in COVID, every day of delay of means another community somewhere will face the next outbreak without adequate tools that we have. So I think the choice is very much before us. We have a choice. Either we continue with the system where developing countries continue to share pathogen sequences, users access it anonymously, and we become billion-dollar products that developing countries ultimately cannot access, or we choose to build an equitable system. The technology is there, the moral case is very clear. We saw the economic arguments are very sound. There's a substantial amount of revenues that we just saw from the previous slides. And I think what we need now as a political will. A lot of there is already proposed by the developing countries, and it is very important that we all support it. The PABS Annex negotiations will determine whether we learn from the painful lessons that we saw during COVID-19 or we repeat them. So for the sake of global health equity, I must say we cannot afford to get it wrong this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chitali. I think, your point about this being not a technical discussion or not just a technical discussion, but a political discussion is really important. And ironically, what we saw when the pandemic agreement was first called for by the European Union was that, the EU also claimed that what we needed was not just a waiver on IP enforcement, as was being requested at the World Trade Organization at the time, but a bigger agreement, a bigger framework that could bring about systemic change and bring about solidarity and equity in pandemic preparedness. And I think now is the time for the EU and also for other actors to act on this promise. Many of the proposals for operationalizing that, the so-called practical measures, have come from the Africa Group and the Group for Equity. And I think your presentation makes clear how complex the system change is. It can't simply be operationalized. Equity can't simply be operationalized only through donations, whether 10% or more, only through affordable pricing of VTDs. That's necessary, but it will also require standardized contracts with labs, databases, all of the users in this complex ecosystem. And in fact, there are many commercial users that you've shown that are not necessarily manufacturers that also need to be held to benefit sharing arrangements through legally binding contracts. And so maybe just the last thing to conclude on before I hand over to Yuan is, it's striking, for example, the cloud-based services you mentioned, how dematerialized that is and how the data travels all across the world. And yet there's recognition quite explicitly in some of the passages you cited that the data originates in particular countries. So I believe DRC was mentioned in one of the slides. And so again, this kind of raises the issue of acknowledging the Nagoya Protocol's principle that pathogens and also digital sequencing information are the sovereign resources of states, and so they are entitled to insist on benefits that arise from sharing of these materials. So thank you for your presentation. And now I'd like to turn to Yuan to reflect on some of the work that MSF has been doing in this area. Thanks, Yuan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lorraine and everyone, for inviting us to share MSF experience in and observations in the current PABS negotiation. So I don't have a very comprehensive slide as Chitali does, but I would like to share a recent position paper we published to outline what MSF from medical humanitarian organizations' perspectives see an effective PABS system should look like. So I will start by saying that our position comes with repeated witness from MSF work in preparing and responding to multiple infectious disease outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics across particularly humanitarian and resource-limited settings. And for many years, we see equitable access for people is not really guaranteed from the beginning of the global response design. This happened, as many of us know, recently during COVID and other outbreaks. And we also see the increasing risk of increased national interest-driven bilateral arrangements, including for sample sharing and segment sharing, that could undermine the possibility for us to have a new global mechanism that put equity at the center from the beginning. So in summarizing our position, we see the current PABS negotiation a critical moment to complete the equity-related provisions that has been adopted last year under the pandemic agreement. So although pandemic agreement, the main text as it stands now, still need to be ratified by member states and still need a lot of operational details in order to make sure some of the good political momentum can be captured. But we would only have a legally binding instrument once PABS is concluded with meaningful outcome. So there are five areas of issues from MSF perspective would make the outcome of PABS meaningful and effective. First of all, we think it's absolutely essential access to pathogen material and data should be linked to the enforceable benefit sharing obligation from the very beginning, upfront, in order to ensure the end product are accessible based on health needs. So in our position paper, we elaborated 2 examples MSF has witnessed and engaged. One is related to the development and the later access situation of Ebola treatment. As we know, for decades, Ebola viral disease went without effective treatment. And then the outbreak during 2014 and 2016 in Western Africa triggered the current breakthrough of innovation, where patients and survivors sample and clinical data were used to support R&D breakthrough. And so after many decades, finally, we have 2 WHO recommended treatments that can be used to treat Ebola disease. However, due to national security concern and lacking benefit sharing arrangement from the beginning and during the research process, there's still no guarantee people who need the treatment the most will get them sufficiently, timely, and effectively. So far, in majority of the situation, countries still rely on ad hoc donation from the US, because the majority of the products are still under the national security stockpiling in the US. And even so, without adequate global allocation and stockpiling. For WHO, there was only very recently under difficult negotiation that WHO was able to secure a very small amount of doses that can be independently allocated. Another example is Ebola data platform. Also taking the lessons learned from the 2014 and 2016 outbreaks, the biggest in those in the past decade, when patients' data and sample were shared without any governance structure to either lead to more responsible research and development later, but also trace the research development process from scientific and clinical perspective. So in collaboration with multiple partners, so MSF joined consortium with multiple partners from academic and public sectors, and established the Ebola data platform under the Infectious Diseases Data Observatory. The platform pursued a collective governance of data sharing mechanism that can integrate access benefit sharing consideration through its entire governance structure. So what it works is that for researchers who would like to get the data from the platform, there's a transparent sharing from the website about what kind of terms and conditions are required, and everybody knows they have to sign a data transfer agreement upfront before getting granted access to user data. So the data transfer agreement and individual requesters, the situation are governed by a collective committee who look at whether the terms are fulfilled. So under the transfer agreement for data, there are benefit sharing obligations, including those requesting research collaboration or not to enforce intellectual property and others. So researcher has transparent information to know what they are requesting and what will be requested from them in return to access into data. So we think from those examples, in order to have an enforceable, responsible, accountable mechanism in the future for pathogens, material, and data, we think the upfront obligation for benefit sharing should be agreed in this negotiation to make sure we actually break from the status quo and bring more accountability in the future. Second area, we would like to see the outcome from the panel negotiation is non-exclusive licensing to WHO or WHO-supported initiatives that can facilitate transfer of technology and diversified production of medical products. So this conditions should be essential and should be included in any benefit sharing arrangement that will be concluded in this negotiation. We think licensing on non-exclusive basis for access, including allowing access to technology and know-how, is a very important mechanism to mitigate the monopolies and to align production and access with public health needs. We have a recent example from COVID not long ago to see totally relying on voluntary willingness to licensing to WHO initiative is completely insufficient. During COVID, WHO launched the technology access pool on voluntary basis. There was no concrete mechanism to support the pool of getting sufficient license from the beginning. And equally for medicines patent pool, who was also supporting the CTAP operation, there was no mechanism to guarantee the pooling of IP and open license and non-exclusive licensing sufficiently anticipated. So purely relying on voluntary terms and conditions, willingness, resulted in very limited licensing and tech transfer initiatives that is transparently governed by global initiatives. So we think the PABS negotiation offers the opportunity to embed beneficiary obligations asking for non-exclusive licensing to WHO or WHO support initiatives that with clear condition for technology transfer and know-how sharing. Third option, we hope the PABS negotiation outcome can enable WHO coordinated stockpiling and allocation for health products to meet health needs, including in human trial context. Basically, we hope the final text will have explicit language linking the implementation of Article 13. This is also based on our experience during COVID, when the human trial buffer and the COVAX facility did not really fit to the purpose when there is no upfront agreement and governance from member state to ensure the human trial needs are embedded from beginning and governed and guaranteed when emergency occurs. So from both preparedness and prevention of lacking equity perspective, we think PABS conclusion is an essential mechanism to support implementation of Article 13 later on. And fourthly, we hope the PABS concluded with transparency and access to pandemic information. Access to member states should provide public access to information on regulatory approval of the product developed through participation in PABS. The PABS itself should also develop norms that can require public disclosure of information regarding recipients of PABS materials and the sequencing information, as well as agreement with manufacturers. This information were not available in public domain easily, especially during COVID, when we know purchase agreement and the COVAX facility were not transparently known. So this brings challenges for organizations like MSF to have the full visibility about what terms and conditions are there, what kind of options we have if we would like to get benefit from globally coordinated mechanism. So therefore, these four positions outlined our anticipation for effective PABS negotiation so that the inequity pitfall during the recent outbreak can be rectified in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Yuan. I think one of the things that came out quite clearly from both your presentation and Chitali's is this issue of non-exclusive licensing, and that it really is a kind of foundation stone of equity. Also because it will avoid artificial supply shortages that we saw during COVID-19. So it's not like there was a natural limit on supply, but it was a function of the IP rights that big manufacturers had, the lack of conditions imposed when public financing was used for vaccine development and building commercialization capacity and so on. So really, again, the point emerges that there's a need for structural transformation and that this can be achieved through things like non-exclusive licensing to WHO, technology transfer, access to know-how. But also, I think, something that emerges quite strongly from the end of your presentation is that information is important. So that we need full information. So not just meaning access to the pathogens, but information about the kinds of contracts that companies enter into, the R&D costs, all of the kind of older debates about access to information need to come into play in this debate as well. If we're going to build a PABS system that actually does deliver equity, justice, transparency, and accountability. So finally, I'd like to turn to Peter van Houston, who will speak further on the issue of the benefit sharing ecosystem and some of the actors at play in it, particularly non-commercial users, and also entities like labs that play an essential role in the PABS Annex and where significant debates remain about accountability of laboratories, databases, and these so-called technical institutions. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Let me just click this button on share. So I am from one of these so-called non-commercial actors at University of the Western Cape, and working in the broader field of disease surveillance. So let's just have a quick step back and look at the system that we're describing. I'm particularly looking at the system that's involved in disease surveillance. That this is before we start with a pandemic response. So you might notice that vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics are not on this diagram, but we have the sample collection, we have the laboratory processing, and then some mechanism for data sharing, and then commercial and non-commercial use. And thank you very much for Chitali in highlighting the extent of commercial use being much, much wider than simply, for instance, Pfizer and so on, as have been discussed. Okay. Then but this loops back some of these commercial users, including some of the ones that like Twist that Totally mentioned, are creating products that feed back into the laboratory processing that you need to do once you received your samples, even further back. But let me focus on this. And then the non-commercial users activity, some of it feeds into interpretation for public health, so that our public health agencies can interpret the data. I mean, this doesn't necessarily go via this, but they are one of the actors that we see. So academics, public health agencies have played key roles in interpreting this data, combining it, seeing how it all relates to each other. And there are, in fact, non-commercial users, academic groups, whose activities feed back into some of the consumables here in the laboratory processing. I'm particularly thinking of groups like the RTEC network and their production of designs for primers for amplifying different viruses that have been so crucial during the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. One of the things that I think is important to notice is that if we look at, for instance, the pandemic influenza P4 preparedness, I presume, the PIP framework, this came from an era where really the focus was on sample to laboratory to sample sharing. As has been pointed out, we now have direct use of the data sharing, the DSI, the digital sequence information, into commercial use. And this is really associated with the growth of biotechnology in the last decades. And that's a larger discussion, but we really have seen that that we need a mechanism that no longer merely talks about the samples, but also talks about the DSI. So the non-commercial users of pathogen DSI some of them academics, public health agencies. We have seen some roles for citizen scientists. There have been some individuals that have, been looking through sequence information, trying to identify new variants, and journalists have, in some cases, also directly looked at DSI, tried to draw conclusions from that if they're appropriately trained. But now, importantly, who's funding these? Governments, clearly, with their science agencies, science funding agencies. Um, either on a kind of government level, multilateral level, either funding in their own countries or in some cases funding activity in other countries. Philanthropists like Gates Foundation and others, Rockefeller, have played an increasing role in recent decades. Wellcome Trust. And then commercial actors. So if we look at some of the viruses samples that are deposited from South Africa, I was looking at recently, not the most important at this point, pandemic potential viruses, but some of them have been sequenced with funding from some of the commercial actors, classic commercial actors such as uh, pharmaceutical companies. So that they do play a role in funding some of the non-commercial users. Okay. And again, I'm focusing here on data sharing. And so historically, what we've been dealing with is data sharing that broadly takes the model of with no terms and conditions at all attached, or is via mechanisms where there's a simple a login into a resource to access some data, and then you can download it. You can access it, do what you want with it. And what's crucial there is even when there have been logins in the past, these have not been, the agreement that has been agreed to get that login has been quite lightweight, not very well developed. Recently, WHO put out a publication on attributes and principles for genomic data sharing platforms supporting surveillance of pathogens with epidemic and pandemic potential. There's a link there to find it. And these are recommendations. And some of the key recommendations are that these platforms should be secure, transparent, accountable, equitable, and sustainable. And I mean, this is the thing. So these are the recommendations. How do we actually action that? They should facilitate rapid sharing of genomic data and metadata, facilitate both specialist and non-specialist analysts. I mentioned the different users of data there. Some journalists, some public health agencies that are not necessarily domain experts want maybe the data more like kind of pre-digested for them. And then these platforms should support collaboration and formation of a community of practice through ethical principles of equity and solidarity. So one of the things that I want to kind of come back to that just bear in mind is this point about rapid sharing. So we've seen the argument for rapid sharing be used to argue that the only mechanism that allows rapid sharing is anonymous access. Okay. And I think that we've seen examples of databases that do require registration and logging on that have been part of rapid sharing of genomic data during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I just think that it's a kind of very unambitious way of thinking to suggest that rapid sharing is only possible with a database that doesn't require any login whatsoever. I mean, we've seen that that's not necessarily the case. But the other thing is that focusing purely on that is really undermining the other parts, the equity, the solidarity, and also, some aspects of sustainability for these resources that are key principles. So that's in a recommendations document, but I think that this gives us some guidance as to how we can think about like what a database should look like in the context of the PABS discussions. Why is it important to have these discussions? Because this is where we're coming from. Okay, so that is Ronald Ross over there. widely credited for his work on discovering the role of mosquitoes in transmitting malaria, um, his wife, and some anonymous people in India where this photo was taken. And I mean, this has not changed nearly enough. I mean, I really like the sign that this protest in Melbourne had. This is from a Smithsonian Magazine article. And yeah, so saying that here we are doing participant observation of the colonial system of science, okay? That we live in it today. That's why we have institutes in Belgium, in Switzerland, the UK, and so on, with names involving tropical medicine in their title, and with large and actually growing collection of samples from their former colonies. I picked up this picture from the Smithsonian magazine, as I mentioned. Interesting that the American government at the moment has not got around to censoring this magazine yet. But I also found a photograph from as recently as 2012 documenting Ebola response in Uganda, where the three white people in the photo were identified, and the sole black man in the background was not given an identity. It was just they didn't supposedly did not know who that was. Okay, so this colonialism is a long shadow felt in the form of extractive economies that direct wealth and even skills towards the global north. I don't think that is news to anybody on this call, but this is why we need a mechanism that can start addressing this if we really want to talk about global pandemic preparedness. Okay. Again, one of the crucial questions here is non-commercial actors. So for how long does something remain non-commercial? So we see this reference to non-commercial actors. Here we have Nigeria, here we have the United States. And I'm thinking about a product made in a American academic institution that's now getting a lot of mileage as a potential surveillance product. You know, when you're doing surveillance of infectious diseases, you need various reagents that help you amplify the signal from the background noise in the samples that you are processing. And the data as it flowed from Nigeria for some viruses of importance like Lassa fever virus, Mpox, etc., went into an open access database. The product, as it flows back to use in Nigeria from the United States, is patented. So Cornell University has a patent, and in the future we can expect this product to be kind of commercialized. So even one of the kind of classically non-commercial actors like academics can have this kind of dual role of either being a gateway to kind of commercialization, or themselves, because of the pressure in the United States academic system to commercialize the products of research, they can themselves be creating intellectual property barriers and be, you know, very ambiguously labeled as non-commercial actors. This is not the only model. There's another very key product that, as I've mentioned earlier, we all use, Arctic, the Arctic amplicon schemes, which are made available under a open license from the University of Birmingham Research Group that is key in making them. But you know, we cannot be relying on this being anybody's choice as to how you behave. Okay. When we make these agreements about under which terms and conditions is digital sequence information being shared, okay, then what are the norms? Okay, we wrote a paper, myself and colleagues at Phage, about norms in microbial data sharing. Funders have a key role in norm shifting because particularly philanthropic funders, but also some of the large global North government funders have been the ones insisting on sharing of digital sequence information of pathogens with absolutely no restrictions on access. Okay, so funders need to play a more constructive role here, but I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for them to do so. That means that if we're talking about any future DSI mechanism that is in being created under the auspices of the pandemic treaty and PABS, we need to actually onboard users to the agreements, and in terms of the data sharing earlier rather than later. We cannot afford to wait for a pandemic to do so. And anonymous access to DSI, as I've shown in that previous slide, creates a loophole which allows you to, so we call it non-commercial wash. I need a better term for that. Creates a loophole which is going to turn into commercial products that are difficult to access. Okay. One of the other key principles from the document I shared earlier is that transparency and accountability is vital for trust. So any mechanism that's involved in sharing of digital sequence information needs to be governed in a transparent and accountable mechanism, because we have an ecosystem, as described in that document, a community of practice that we are trying to cultivate. So arbitrary restrictions on who has access to DSI are not acceptable. Once we have a mechanism for onboarding users, agreements are signed, then access needs to be governed by these agreements and by a transparent system of accountability and to avoid empire building around collections of digital sequence information. Okay. And again, coming back to that early rather than later onboarding, if we want to onboard people to agreements, if we want to make a system that works when we crucially need it during a pandemic, we need the investment mechanism now. So that means that, there's the title of this webinar is about, well, when should we be seeing benefit sharing happening? Benefit sharing needs to be happening now. I don't believe that the benefit sharing under this current agreement is going to be adequate to cover all that is needed, but we cannot wait to kind of start filling up the investment coffers for when there's an emergency, and then try and build something there. Okay. So can PABS give us an alternative to philanthropy? Only if it was well designed. We need to invest early in these platforms, and we need to direct benefit sharing towards surveillance as well as vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. I recognize that this is not the simplest thing to do because of surveillance being an ongoing cost. Yeah, so and specifically, I'm thinking of making available laboratory agents and consumables and working to change the manufacturing ecosystem around those so that it is less concentrated in the global north. Workforce development so that we can actually retain workforce globally, not have them being poached into the global north. And then, as I've been talking the whole way along, digital sequence information sharing platforms. Here, just to show, here's where some of my colleagues work, the INRB in DRC. This is Twist Biosciences, as has previously been mentioned. We estimate that the next generation sequencing portfolio, their revenue was about 120 million in 2023. We expect that to be 260 million this year. Okay. Part of that is some of the products made from global genomic surveillance, and that amount is substantially more than the budget of the INRB, which is, if anybody knows the field, INRB in Kinshasa is a crucial institute in terms of the work they've been doing to monitor disease outbreaks, including really worrying things like Ebola outbreaks and much, much more in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So how are we going to create a mechanism that makes for them to be sustainable and allows them to actually play the role that they can play, all people globally to play a role that they can play in keeping our world safe and healthy. So yeah, this is the world we live in at the moment. This is GDP per capita. And when we see those arrows that I showed earlier, where Nigeria is giving for free to the United States, but then the United States wants to kind of commercialize and sell the resulting product to Nigeria. This is absurd, right? Yeah, so I will end there.
Thanks, Peter. I think your presentation highlights the huge monetary value attached to PABS materials and DSI, but also the striking lack of benefit in places like DRC and the INDRI that you mentioned that supply these resources to the global market. And I think, as you've said, it's explained by the fact that we're living in the long and persistent shadow of colonialism, colonial science, extractivism. And I think that's exactly why legal regimes are important as a corrective, so that we can align scientific practice with some of the norms that WHO itself, right, lists in the slide that you had up earlier. And so, of course, in this case, we're defending, in a very real sense, the ABS norms encoded in the CUD and the Nagoya Protocol. But also, there is another legal layer, which is signing of contracts, which all of the speakers have mentioned as an important kind of mechanism to ensure predictable benefit sharing. And of course, I think one of the things that's really clear in relation to your presentation, also Chitali's, is there is no clear distinction between commercial and non-commercial users. That these are often fuzzy boundaries and they shift over time. And so that's why I think in terms of legally binding benefit sharing obligations, all users probably need to be bound by contracts at the point of access. So I am going to ask if there's anyone that would like to submit a question from the floor. There are questions in the Q&A and also questions in the chat. So that is there, but if there's anyone, I see Ricardo that you've put questions in the chat. Let's just see. Okay, so Ricardo, please go ahead. I'm gonna ask Rania. Yeah, you can unmute and go ahead and ask your question. Thanks.
Hi, Larry. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Great, thanks. I have a weird setup because I'm listening in my phone, but I hear you and watching you in the computer, but I think it's working. Very quickly, this is great and it's so much information, so I really appreciate it because sometimes it's hard to get into the depth. I put some questions in the chat, also happy to follow the discussions afterward, but a couple of things. First, on your first presentation, Shetali, thanks for that. I was just wondering, I think everyone's recognized, or most people recognize the need for the monetary benefit. But I think there has been a discussions of different models, right? And I don't know if you have a view of which one it would be the ideal one, or if there is a way to have several ones at the same time. I don't know. So they have some countries that they prefer a revenue model. There are some countries that they prefer more like a subscription model. There are some countries that prefer like a fixed rate, and there are different conversations there. And then when you put those in the table, the response is always that there are different participants with different capacities. So I don't know how we can deal with that, and what is your view on that. Also on benefit on fake, I think the conversations are going in the right direction. I think there is a recognition that we need benefit during fake, and that's very important. I'm just wondering, what, in your view, what could the package look? It seems that during pandemic, we're going to have like the most robust mandatory one with it is maybe monetary mandatory and other mandatory as well, and then some options. And in fakes, I don't know how could look a good compromise if it is mandatory BTDs plus monetary benefit plus options. Like what would be an interesting combination there? And then I'm not going to read all the questions. Some are them as well, but just for you, Peter, and I think you also touched on this, Chitalia, about the participants. I think that the Bureau text, which is far for being a consensual text, but it recognized the the reality that some participant could switch right from commercial to non-commercial, back and forward, etc. And I think it's a reality that we need to deal with, because even though, of course, some of them are going to switch, some of them are not, right? So I guess you cannot impose some type of benefit for those that are never going to change. So I guess they were trying to address that, and they put some provisions that they were trying to deal with that switch from non-commercial to commercial. But I'm wondering if you see that those provisions are enough, or what type of provisions has to be in the annex to deal with it. If that's something that with the contract is enough to solve, like how we can solve those change of participant dynamic. And just one last comment, and thanks for the opportunity. Chetalia, at the beginning of your presentation, you called the adoption of the pandemic agreement as an historic momentum. And I agree. I think there was a world happiness around that moment, because we recognized the need to change what we had. And clearly during COVID, we had a fragmented system, non-transparent at all, unequal, etc. And we see some movement from that with the provisions of the pandemic agreement. And of course, the expectations were higher for many people, including me. And I guess some of the provisions could have been stronger. But I think that there has to be a recognition that it will put us at least a bit better of what we were in COVID, right? And I think the worst case scenario will be to go back to 2020 and not have anything, and then just rely to what we had at that moment. So how we can strike a balance that we have, yes, a strong PABS system that delivers, so it's not at all costs, but that we can allow the pandemic agreement to enter into force and to be implemented, and to have something that can change, because the world is asking for it. Thanks, really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Ricardo. Chitali, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. Thanks, Lauren. I'd like Lauren and Gopa also to answer on a couple of these questions. The first part that he was just asking Ricardo about the revenue models. I may not be aware of all the revenue models, but I think going by what we have been having a discussions and looking at what is it, I think the revenue-based model is what serve the purpose, because if we talk about a cost recovery based model, it may not be true to the ABS principles. So it's like saying you provide genetic resources and you're only entitled to seek the cost and not the profits of wealth. So I think in that sense, maybe revenue based model would be a better option. And I think another part that you just asked, would mandatory VTDs or options of mandatory VTDs, tech transfer, a good part of the package? I think options are for providing flexibilities to users for taking into their specific circumstances. Ideally, we should, as I said, also we should talk about standard benefits. And if they need to the adjustments, I think they can apply to the WHO. I think something like that. But it's always good to have a standardized contracts where everything is put in place. I'd just like Gopal, Lauren also to answer on that part.
So I will hand over to Gopa. Gopa, if you're able to open your mic.
Yeah. Probably, I think I'll answer the larger question as to whether next pandemic, there will be any qualitative change. Definitely, there would be a qualitative change, but that change is by and large coming from the amendment of the IHR rather than from the pandemic agreement. Why I am saying so is that pandemic agreement rightly recognizes the determinants of access, okay, from regulatory R&D to the procurement and logistics. It recognizes the various bottlenecks, but the measures it propose to address that are suboptimal. So it may not work very well because it is by and large qualified with all the obligations of the parties are qualified with various legal terminologies. I am not getting into that as of now. So basically it gives a wriggle room for countries to escape from their legal obligations. So that's a sum and short of it. So coming back to the pandemic agreement again. So what were the concerns prior to the pandemic agreement? We faced large-scale hoarding of health products during COVID. And even after the COVID, apart from the hoarding, there were only limited manufacturers. So therefore, they are not in a position to supply everywhere. So the idea was to address this issue effectively by geographically diversified production. So there are no concentration of production. So it large number of participant manufacturers they can supply. And second, we address there should be some kind of guaranteed access, because every country cannot produce it. So there are countries who do not have any kind of manufacturing capabilities in the pharmaceutical sector. So therefore, they would be able to have a guaranteed access, because everybody is contributing to the system of prevention and preparedness of the pandemic. So these are the two basic ideas. If you look from that perspective, the only provision which guaranteed access is through Article 12. And still we do not have no clarity whether there would be guaranteed access during an early outbreak or PHEIC. These are very important from a public health perspective, because early containment, that is what is required. So that negotiation is going to take place. Then it comes to geographically diversified production. Everything is qualified. They have recognized the idea, but then we come to this article 9.5, which compared to all other paragraphs or all other article other than the Article 12, has a provision which is not qualified, but it has its own qualification. I'll come into that soon. It basically says that every country should have a policy whenever they grant a public fund for the research and development of pandemic-related products. They should ensure that access to such product is ensured. And then it further goes and says, such provisions may include, then it gives a non-exhaustive list of 5 types of measures. One is licensing, second is affordable pricing policies, third, provisions of enabling access technology to facilitate R&D, publication of relevant information on clinical trials, adherence to product development, product allocation framework. Any of these or none of these, they can have their own other provisions, will satisfy the obligation under 9.5. And they can say that, okay, hey, we have collaborated, so that will promote, or we have a differential pricing that will satisfy Article 9.5. So the whole diversifying production or transfer of technology part, it is suboptimal. And another most important weakness is that WHO has no role in any of this. But if you look at IHR clearly says that WHO should look at the access issues, and then they should publish the status of access and affordability, and they should take various measures to facilitate diversified production, local production. So they are empowered to do that. Under the PA, they are not in a position to do that. So things will be different, definitely. And I am sure even in the pandemic agreement, because so much discussion happened and countries have put so much effort with all these legal qualifications, there is something for them to do it. That is coming from more of a moral pressure, but not from a legal pressure. So let me finish it here.
Thanks, Kopa. Someone is speaking. But maybe I'll just add very quickly that also in relation to 9.5 and the public funding, placing conditions on public funding. And maybe Peter has something to say about this also, because as a researcher sitting in the university in the Global South, I can tell you that we're very dependent on funding from philanthropic organizations and from other governments. And so when we sign contracts with these big organizations, these big funders, they place conditions on us and how we use our data, how we store it, how we commercialize it. And public funding, if it's meant to be government funding, national government funding from your own government, is very limited in proportion to those other sources of funding. And so, at least from a Global South perspective, even if your own government places conditions on public funding, the likelihood is that they're often not the ones paying for your research. And then just very briefly, I think to the extent that we end up with an annex that undermines the Nagoya Protocol and the established principle of ABS, I really think we risk ending up in a worse situation in 2020. And we end up legitimizing biopiracy and extractivism, and that would have repercussions across many other forums. So I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to these questions. No. There are questions Dr. Abhishek Bacha placed in the chat.
Lauren,
So,
Moga
yes.
also raised her hand. So
Thank you. I didn't see Moga. Please go ahead. Sorry about that.
Hello. First, thank you so much, as usual. Really excellent presentations, really excellent. And just tackling the issue from different language. So I put a process question, which is, do you share this data with negotiators? And I mean all negotiators, not just Southern negotiating, to empower them to have the evidence, but also know the negotiators to know the danger of what they, with evidence and examples. Like Shitali, you put real examples, and Peter as well, of how things work. And to be honest, these negotiators, as you know, they're diplomats. Of course, they have the people in the back room who are experts, but still, at least for Europeans, they have one kind of expertise, as it were, or one direction of expertise. So they need to be hammered with the others. I really hope that you share this. And if you haven't so far, I hope you find a way of sharing your evidence somehow. And I'm sure Third World Network would help with that, or MSF would help with that. So that's just on process, because I think what you're offering is very, very valuable. And from what I see with negotiators, as I say, not all of them are experts. Just on the data and all this kind of a debate around PABS. I mean, it's clear to anybody who doesn't know anything about anything that if you don't have contracts and registration and all that, there is a huge the risk of what's it called? Biopiracy, sorry. And but more kind of serious biosecurity. I really don't understand how the Europeans think that by having this wonderful open anonymous access, and also equating open with anonymous, having this is like it's okay, they can control who is going to have access. But that's one thing. But the other, that's kind of a comment, but because I still don't understand how they think about it. But one issue that attract my attention about making money from data, not from the products, but from the data before the product. And you, Peter, you put the example of the Nigeria, but then you put the example of DRC. So if you have a data hub like in the north, they know how to commercialize and how to make money and raise millions from selling this data, or I don't know, commercializing this data. But we don't have similar thing in the south. So what I was wondering is, what are the issues that the PABS system, like a global PABS system, how far can it go in enabling an equitable kind of use, if you like, of data, and how much is a national legislations and laws and things that it needs to happen? I mean, basically, what is inside, what should be the minimum inside a global data system, a global PABS system, and what is up to governments to enforce. And when I mean up to governments, I mean the government to enforce on themselves and on their institutions, but also on private institutions in the country, on money coming from, like, the funders that you're talking about, Lauren. Where is the government in this? I don't know. Am I clear?
Yes, so there's a biosecurity question, and then there's a question about the national versus global split in terms of managing what happens with data. So I don't know if
what should be the flags, the red flags that you put, Shitali, you put in your presentation something, I think, about what did you call it? Essential or something. You put 4 or 5 things as essential. So what is the essential that this PAP system should have, and what is up to governments to deal with?
Can I start with a small answer, and I think then Shatali can probably put all the strength to it. But yes. So what the global north, the EU, etc., negotiators have been saying is it's unfeasible to charge money for maybe the sequence of an individual sample. I understand. If we look at these products that I mentioned from Twist and others, they normally aggregate research work taking place in multiple sites often across different time periods. I think that I think that basically then saying, okay, it's now impossible to put an individual monetary value on each individual sequence is sidestepping the discussion, which is that we need to basically talk about tracing the access and the flow of this data through the system. Okay. And then Chitali, I'm sure, has more thinking in terms of like what mechanisms that we can then talk about in terms of benefit sharing. But at the moment, when it's a free for all, where it must be open for some and then at a certain point closed for others, then we actually lack the data to understand this flow very, very well. But I mean, I'm not saying that PABS is going to reverse global colonialism in its aftermath, but we have an information gap, which I think you recognize as well for the biosecurity perspective. But yeah, so
Yeah, I think I agree with Peter on this, that the biosecurity issue, of course, the way we are using it at the moment is completely I think anonymous. It's not completely, but kind of anonymous. So it creates that gap that we are looking at in both in terms of biosecurity as well as in terms of traceability mechanism. So I think that is the whole purpose of this PABS thing, that we want to close that plug so we know what is going where and what is coming out from where. So I think coming from both a science background and from a commercial background, I've worked in the industry for long. So I think if both these systems can be plugged together, that will be one of the best ways how we can actually get an equitable benefit sharing mechanism. So,
Nitin?
Lauren, there are two questions from Abhishek, I think, that are there in the chat. I think one of them relates to, he's just asking about medicine patent pools foster agreements with patent holding pharmaceutical companies that enable non-exclusive voluntary licenses and technology transfer to generic manufacturers and LMICs. I think, of course, there are a lot of things also written about that. But I don't know, my personal perspective also is that though two of the products, for example, molnupiravir and nirmatrelvir, both were before launches were launched. But I think there are studies that show that much of the Paxlovid that entered into the license was after 93% of it was already like it was needed. So I think it was quite late in that. And also, I think in terms of vaccine, we should also be aware of one thing, that most of the licenses that came through were for small molecules and not for vaccines. So we also need to be wary of that the tech transfer and the licensing capabilities that companies have with respect to small molecules is different from what we are talking about vaccines. So I think in that perspective also we need to look at the voluntary licensing, because the companies need to have that kind of a tech transfer capability to take the licenses So that is why I think majority of these are the ones that we are seeing are small molecules at the moment, and we did not see much of the, and also I think it was more of what we are talking about is a very closed system where it is not for a charity or grant. Pfizer and Merck came forward and agreed to be a part of it. They could have backed out. So that is what we are demanding. It should not be a charity. There should be a steady, and I think I think there is something which is called a stable, that we should not be on charities, and it should be a stable mechanism where everything gets transferred. So I think he also has, I'll ask Nitin and then I'll answer the last question he's put forward.
Thank you, Chitali. Nitin?
I just have just one simple question, because we hear a lot about benefit sharing side. I just worried about a little bit about the access side, right? Because we have somehow taken for granted that, okay, access is anyhow there for everyone. It's keeping happening, etc., etc. But the question is, if we don't have laboratories and databases which undertake this responsibility to share access without discrimination, would we be true to open science? Would we be true to open access? Or it's just that we take it for granted that these labs and databases would keep sharing things for everyone at every point of time? Thank you.
Thanks, Nitin. I don't know who wants it. Yeah.
Yeah, Lauren, there's one more question. He's saying that Dr. Abhishek Bhatia put a question. We could have charged for the data instead of providing it open access. And so now if it's open access or remuneration, advantage is the benefit. No, I don't think ABS is actually based on this principle. It's not about charging anything upfront. It's just about sharing the benefits as and when they are made. So I think the crux is that it should be access and benefit sharing. It should not be like we take the payments upfront and then. So I think that defeats the purpose of having an ABS agreement. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks.
Thanks, Chitali. And then I'm not sure if any one of the panelists wants to come in on Nitin's question, which focuses on accountability of databases and laboratory networks, and who oversees them if they choose to be part of the system.
Yeah, I think his question answered itself. I think he put it very, very well, that we talk about access, but access needs to come from the data actually being there, deposited, the systems being in place. Yeah, and then it's I actually think that we are the real open science people, to be honest, because I want to build the scientific capacity everywhere, the data sharing capacity everywhere. The people who want just access, no terms and conditions, the data there's an alternative ways available. Simply do not share. If you have no equitable mechanism for sharing, we know many people simply do not share. So do you want to see it, or do you not want to see it? If we actually want a world that is equitably that is sharing data, that is making pandemic surveillance available, it will happen with equity, or to a large extent, it will not happen. And I think that is how we can. That's my last point on this. I think you don't need to give me any more microphone time, Lauren. But yeah,
Thanks.
they do not recognize that this is what we're facing.
Thank you. Yuan, Chitali, any concluding comments?
I'll allow you on.
Yeah, maybe very quickly, because I was reading through the chat and the exchange and read Carlos' question. Maybe from where we see is really from MSF's perspective, we look at the outcome really as part of the overall pandemic agreement design. So none of the equity related provision would be sufficient if it's operated by itself. So we think PABS offer a very important opportunity to go beyond the status quo if the mechanism is effective, enforceable, and clear. But equally, it's the effective design and implementation of 12, which depend on the annex and future implementation, are also supportive to other provisions. Likewise, some of the other provisions concluded when implemented effectively are also supportive to the overall achievement of equitable access. So we really hope eventually the member state can conclude this loop so we can have the full equity package ready. And in terms of the main agreement, indeed, the main agreement should have been more ambitious than now. But from our reading, it does provide some political opportunities for advocate to continue building. So for several areas such as 9.5, 9.3, and transparency provisions across 13 and 14, and commitment for coordinating the mechanism. So we think there's a lot of opportunities there that require political support, continued political support, and continued pushing. And PABS, a meaningful PABS is absolutely essential to make sure we close the whole loop. Thanks.
Chiptali? Yeah.
Thanks, Lauren. I think I already reiterated the points that I need, and I think what we need is a rapid and timely sharing of all the PABS materials, the sequence information, and I think it should be on an equal footing. We need a fair, timely, and equitable sharing of benefits, especially both monetary and non-monetary. And I think another important point is we need to close this loop on the anonymous users. We need a predictable DSI system, and also I think the important one being we need standardized contracts. We do not need those ad hoc bilateral contracts going on the sides, and there is no predictable mechanism by that way. I think that is what will ensure equitable system for public health purposes. Thank you.
Thanks, Chitali. And then maybe I will just add to that in an increasingly geopolitically fractured world, and thinking about Nitin's question, I think probably also what we need is labs and databases that take an obligation to provide access without discrimination and to commit to that in their contracts with WHO. Since it seems like the option of, for example, a WHO database is increasingly off the table. So thank you to everyone who's attended. We hope it was helpful. We hope it informs your advocacy in the days ahead, since the negotiations are entering a crucial phase. And let's keep pushing for equity in the PABS Annex, since that really is the last chance, given the conclusion of the main agreement in May 2025. Thank you so much, and wishing you a pleasant weekend.